Welcome back to AP World History Modern Test Prep for Unit 5. Today, this video is going to be revolutionary, or at least that's going to be the theme of Unit 5. We're going to spend some time looking at political revolutions and then spend some time exploring the Industrial Revolution. So what led really to all of this change in the period of 1750 to 1900? Well, context tells us how we got here, and the major thing to point at in this unit is going to be the Enlightenment. We often think of change as something that happens fast, all of a sudden, and many times it is, like an event that suddenly changes everything. But change is often slow, and while we can usually point at an event where there is a before and an after, the event itself usually came after a long series of events that built up to that point. The Enlightenment was much like this. No one really knew they were in the middle of the Enlightenment when it was happening. It's when people look back at history and could see all the moving pieces and the writings and could group them together and see, well, a movement was at work. It's like when we look back at our almost 3-year-old and don't realize how big he's getting because we're just in the middle of it. You see, many Enlightenment thinkers actually lived and wrote their ideas prior to the period that we are in of 1750 to 1900, way back in the late 1500s and 1600s, and even some into the early 1700s. But it wasn't until the late 1700s that they really started to gain steam. The ideas were printed more and circulated more, and people then thought, hey, this is good, I agree with this. But even popular movies that we've enjoyed, like The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings trilogy, were books that were written back in the 1930s, way before they were ever popular movies. Now, the philosophers of the Enlightenment began to push back on the norms of the social and kind of political structures at the time. They started to question the idea of divine right and monarchies that had all of the power. They started questioning rights and how much money and family line really shouldn't determine if you have more or less rights. We eventually see that people challenge the ideas of women having less rights than men, and even the institution of slavery. For thousands of years, these power structures existed, and the Enlightenment changed the whole game. Now, for the AP test, you don't need to know all of these philosophers, but I would know a few. Number 1, John Locke. He's pretty much the original OG. He's the guy that originally wrote that people have natural and unalienable rights, and those rights included life, liberty, and property. The job of the government was to protect those rights, and if a government failed to do that, well, the people were justified to overthrow or revolt against that government. Seems like Unit 5 is all about revolutions. We're going to circle back to John Locke's ideas. All right, number 2, Rousseau. He wrote the book, The Social Contract. Now, the idea of the social contract is that people give up some of their freedoms for the good of the community. When you do this, the individual is protected then by the community, but obviously is still free. It's the idea of giving up some of your rights to follow laws because those laws protect the good of all the people. Usually I equate this to speed limits, where we give up the right to drive 100 miles an hour on the highway because we know it's good for the community and it's safer if we have a speed limit that decreases accidents. Or let's just totally be honest, with the recent events of COVID-19 pandemic, the idea of giving up your right to hang out in large gatherings or even just sit in a Starbucks, which I miss so desperately, but that will decrease the spread of the coronavirus and protect the community. And that as a whole is the exact idea of the social contract. Rousseau. Easy one for you to remember. Number 3, Montesquieu. He wrote about the ideas of separation of powers, which directly then challenges the idea of divine right, and having 3 branches of government: executive, judicial, and legislative. This separation then makes it less likely that someone can abuse their power because there are these checks and balances. Number 4, Voltaire. Now, Voltaire wrote about basically the importance of free speech. I always remember V for Voltaire. Now, he also was all about religious toleration, and the famous quote that he actually didn't write sums it up very well. I disagree with what you have to say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. Yeah, he didn't actually say that, but many people, it comes from his ideas. There are many other Enlightenment thinkers like Hobbes and Hume, Descartes, Diderot, Kant, and many, many more writers. Many of them, Locke, Hume, Rousseau, are also popular characters in the TV show Lost. And if you have any extra time for another Netflix series, let's say, when you're done with the AP test, obviously, check out Lost. You will thank me later. Now, one key thing to remember is that the Enlightenment didn't push one political structure, like, let's say, democracy, but really pushed for governments that protected rights and challenged the social hierarchies that had been around for generations. But it did lead to major revolutions, and there are 3 revolutions that I want you to be familiar with for the AP test: the American, the French, and the Haitian. Now, Central and South America will also have other revolutions, named the Latin American revolutions, that will create the independent states and end Spanish and Portuguese colonial rule in the Americas. Now, you need to know the major causes and effects of these revolutions, so let's break it down pretty quickly. Now, on the notes sheet that you can find in the description below, you can first just write down Enlightenment, Enlightenment, Enlightenment in all the boxes because it's a cause for every single revolution. But also really could be good contextualization if you ever had to write an LEQ or a DBQ about revolutions, and then could be more specific about causes or effects in the actual essay. So why did the American Revolution begin? Well, besides the Enlightenment ideals that you already wrote down, you need to understand the French and Indian War to really get the whole picture. Now, the French and Indian War was between the British on one side and the Native Americans and the French on the other. Remember, the Native Americans and the French got along much better than pretty much every other European group. Short version later, 7 years, the British win, the French lose. Now, wars cost money, and Britain, as the mother country, foots the bill for all that fighting. So who do they tax? Well, the colonists. They're the ones that are going to make up that money. The Revenue Act, the Stamp Act, the Tea Act all raised taxes on those British colonists, and they were unhappy with that, and it led to the familiar phrase, no taxation without representation. Remember, the Enlightenment is challenging those existing political structures, and they're fighting for more individual rights. And after the Boston Tea Party and battles at Lexington and Concord, we eventually have the Declaration of Independence, which essentially is an official breakup note saying America is leaving the relationship. King George III disagrees, and then we have the American Revolution. Now, the American Revolution ends with the colonists winning, as you probably know. The major effect is a new confederacy born in North America. Eventually, the Articles of Confederation fail and a federal system is utilized where they form a representative democracy guided by a constitution that espouses the ideas of Montesquieu and separation of powers. 6 months later, they add the Bill of Rights, which had a lot of Enlightenment ideas like the First Amendment, which supported free speech and freedom of religion. I'm looking at you, Voltaire. It will also inspire other revolutions across the globe. The French Revolution was different in that it was not a colony breaking away from a mother country, but a European state that had citizens challenging the monarchy, with the desire really for political rights and a constitutional monarchy to be created. At least that was the goal initially. It too was caused by Enlightenment ideals, but the context is important to understand here. The French had some serious financial issues. They lost lands to the British, and with the losing of the 7 Years' War, that was kind of a big deal, and wars always cost money, and so it caused economic issues for France. Plus, the people were starving, and hangry people, let me tell you, will always revolt. So the Estates General was called in France to deal with this financial crisis. And they have to remember that the events leading up to the French Revolution included inequity in the power structures of the 3 estates system. The first estate was the clergy. It was less than 1% of the population. The second estate was the aristocracy or the nobles, about 2%. And the third estate, 98% of the French citizens. And how do you get out of financial crisis? You raise taxes. And who do you think they should tax? The third estate, the commoners. Now, Enlightenment ideals, fueled the pushback of a system that benefited the top percent. And after some disagreements with the Third Estates and they got locked out, they met at the tennis courts, created the Tennis Court Oath, and the National Assembly was birthed. They demanded a constitutional monarchy, which limited the rights of the king. Now, for the sake of brevity, it gets crazy in France. There's the storming of the Bastille and the establishment of the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, or as John Green calls it, the Doromac. That's pretty easy. Now, they achieve a constitutional monarchy, but then the crazy side occurs when they no longer desire a constitutional monarchy and they want a republic. It leads to the Reign of Terror with Maximilien Robespierre, and the guillotine and lots of beheadings and hypocrisy of wanting more rights while also denying people rights and freedoms. Fast forward, there's lots of beheadings. That also includes King Louis, Marie Antoinette, and even Maximilien Robespierre. And if you want more on his story, you gotta look that up because that's pretty intense alone. As we look at effects, the French Revolution feels successful and unsuccessful, depending on where you look at it on the timeline. Short version, they did end the absolute monarchy and they achieved a constitutional monarchy they wanted. But then they wanted a republic. And then there was the Reign of Terror. And then they did establish the Directory as a republic. Yay! And then Napoleon came along and overthrew the whole system. And then we went back to an authoritarian government. And then we went back to a constitutional monarchy, eventually, after Napoleon. It gets very tricky as you look at France. That was the French Revolution. The Haitian Revolution was similar to the American Revolution in that they were a colony that was attempting to throw off France, their colonial mother country. It's important to remember the events of the Haitian Revolution often mirror the events of the French Revolution because they were happening concurrently or at the same time. Let me explain what I mean by that. There were clear tensions in the social classes in Haiti, and there were white plantation owners, but there were also free, wealthy, mixed-race citizens, mulattoes. There were also petite blancs, or poor whites in Haiti, and a very, very large number of enslaved people who were the byproduct of the Atlantic slave trade. Now, the colony's white population numbered about 40,000, mulattoes and free blacks about 28,000, but the enslaved Africans an estimated 450,000. Due to this, there are various voices who want freedom, or at least increased rights. Really, all four groups, really. People in Saint-Domingue, the name of the colony at the time, were very much inspired by both the French and the American Revolution. The Haitian Revolution was different from the American Revolution in that who was really leading the charge. In Haiti's story, it began as a slave revolt and will result in the elimination of slavery there and the establishment of the Republic of Haiti. Those most clearly are the effects if we kind of went backwards here. Causes, you ask? It is definitely caused by the tensions in social classes. But truly, it is caused by the number of enslaved people who revolt against the terrible mistreatment and denial of the most basic rights. Toussaint Louverture is the guy that you need to remember for his leadership. He was enslaved, but then later was part of the free black population. He eventually joined the revolt, and that was started already by enslaved Africans and then fought for an independent Haiti. More and more, Saint-Domingue is gaining more and more freedom and autonomy, or the right to rule themselves. Now, this revolution is complex, as it's constantly being impacted by the events that are occurring simultaneously in the French Revolution. Eventually, Napoleon takes control, and then there are huge fears back in Haiti that they would reinstate the slavery that they fought against. And since that was a major moneymaker for France in the sugar and coffee industries, that was a legit fear. The French forced Toussaint back to France, and then the revolution continued. 1804, they broke free of France and became a free republic. Unfortunately, the French required ridiculous indemnity payments for the loss of revenue, and financial independence for Haiti was never really fully able, and they could never really thrive once they were free from their colonial chains. The Latin American revolutions were a series of revolutions that took place in the 1800s, which resulted in a number of independent countries in Latin America. Whereas the American Revolution was led by educated and often wealthy colonists and the Haitian Revolution was sparked by a slave revolt, Creoles led the fight for independence in much of Latin America. Remember, the Creoles were Europeans who were born in the Americas. They never knew life back in Europe. In South America, a Creole named Simón Bolívar was greatly impacted by the American Revolution, once again, and he wanted to create a confederacy of states in South America. While that did not happen, he did help the states of Venezuela and Bolivia and Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Panama all achieve independence from the Spanish Empire. Now, there are a few sources that the College Board wants you to be familiar with. Let's say I made this claim. The ideals of the Enlightenment are clearly reflected in revolutionary documents and influence resistance to existing political authority. That's my claim. As we look at some of these sources and documents, I want you to find evidence that support the claim that I just gave, that indeed the documents were impacted by the Enlightenment and influenced revolutions. I'm going to show you 3 documents on the screen. Pause the video and read each of them and see if you can find the evidence to support my claim, that indeed the documents were impacted by the Enlightenment. Now, what would you pull out from this document that was inspired by the Enlightenment? Most clearly, the line unalienable rights, that among these life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness are near replicas of John Locke's ideas of life, liberty, and property. You also see the idea of consent of the governed right in there. I think this is what most people would identify right away as evidence of the Enlightenment ideals. I think the most powerful part of this document is the line then at the end that says that how governments that fail to uphold these rights, the people have the right to alter or to abolish it and to institute new governments. This really is just right from the playbook about how the Enlightenment then urged people to rise up and fight against the British and King George III and have the entire revolution. The French Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen was birthed during the French Revolution. Let's look at a small excerpt of their first 5 articles. Do you see evidence of Enlightenment ideals here? My hope is again you see John Locke in Article 1, but do you also see evidence of Rousseau's ideas? Remember Rousseau, who wrote The Social Contract, and the idea of how we give up some of our individual liberties for the good of the group? Do you see that in the text? Number 4 and 5 discuss how our liberty allows certain freedoms, but is limited if it hurts a society. Bolivar's letter from Jamaica on the eve of the Latin American Revolution says this. What evidence or support of our claim do you see in this passage? I hope you see that this is reminiscent of the principles of John Locke, that the government has a contract in which the people insist on a good government and respecting the rights of the people. If I were to challenge Bolivar, I would maybe challenge his comparison of being a colony of Spain puts them in a position lower than slavery, when he, more than anyone back in Spain, would have known firsthand what it looks like to be a slave. Anyway, if I were writing a DBQ, I could create a claim paragraph that puts all of these documents together, much like organizing, your research note cards, and it would look like this. The ideals of the Enlightenment are clearly reflected in the revolutionary documents. For example, the Declaration of Independence is undoubtedly influenced by John Locke's principles of natural rights, as the Declaration speaks of life, liberty, and happiness. Additionally, it describes how people have the right to overthrow unjust governments, which was the purpose of the Declaration of Independence. And then I would cite Doc 1. Similarly, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of Citizen says that the people are born and remain free and equal in rights, which again demonstrates Locke's influence. It is also a clear demonstration of the social contract in Articles 4 and 5, where people gave up personal liberties for the good of the community. Doc 2 cited. Finally, Simón Bolívar also demonstrates Locke's ideas, where he is attempting to protect the rights of citizens in the letter from Jamaica. Doc 3. It is obviously clear that these historical documents were influenced by the Enlightenment writers. And then after writing that, I would for sure have added a point of view analysis on Simón Bolívar as a Creole, and then the whole "we are a slave to Spain" part that I would critique. The Enlightenment also doesn't just inspire revolutions. We will see that it also challenges power structures that deny rights to women and exploits people through slavery. The first feminist movement begins during this time. Now, before you get all huffy on the other side of the screen where you think that feminism means things that it doesn't, let's just remember that feminism is simply giving equal rights to women. The majority of women during this time were fighting for suffrage, which means the right to vote. Olympe de Gouges wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Women and Female Citizen, which, yes, sounds like the Doromag as she was from France, and felt that the French Revolution left out women in their fight for equality. Mary Wollstonecraft wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women, and she fought for women's education and the simple belief that women were equal to men and not mere arm ornaments for them. The most famous event regarding women's in this first wave of feminism would be the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, which was a women's rights convention. I often think people think that it was only ladies at the convention, but rather there were many male allies who worked alongside of women for equality there. Unfortunately, the enduring continuity from every single unit of this course, including this one still, is patriarchy and the denial of equal rights to women. In the United States, do you know when women gained the right to vote? Not until after World War I. That's when the 19th Amendment was ratified, in August of 1920. 100 years ago. Additionally, the Enlightenment brought about thoughts to challenge the Atlantic slave trade. The movement is built upon previous ideals and starts first with Great Britain outlawing the trade of slaves and eventually slavery as a whole in its colonies. This will then spread to other European nations and eventually to the United States, who ended the slave trade in 1807, but it wasn't after till the Civil War in 1865 that the 13th Amendment was ratified and ended the institution. All right, back to 1750 to 1900, we have another major change and a revolutionary shift in history, the Industrial Revolution. On the most basic level, the Industrial Revolution is the change from making things with your hands to then making them with a machine. This will increase production exponentially and will be so much quicker. The revolutionary part is how this changed the world, economically, environmentally, socially. In my AP class, we spend a day as groups sitting around tables with giant whiteboards playing the urban game. With their giant whiteboard, they have to draw a rural village from 1700. They start with 2 roads, 10 houses sporadically around there, and lots of trees and a river. Then I make them draw all 100 trees. Now, as the game goes on, students have to add to their drawing. First, the water wheel was invented, and people could harness the power of the river on their map. Soon, the first factory was built on the river, and a new machine could spin and weave cloth 100 times faster than it could be by hand. Making this much cloth increased profits exponentially as well. This creates new jobs, and so people move into your community. And then you need more houses, and then you even need more, and then more factories emerge on the river. And so you start building tenement buildings or apartment buildings as we call them today. Workers work long hours in the factory setting. The average workday goes from 6 a.m. till 9 p.m. with one 30-minute break for lunch. Yikes. After work, people are exhausted and stressed out, so they go to pubs, so they have to draw pubs on their map. Alcohol begins to be consumed throughout England in record numbers during this time. Women are working in factories. Then kids work in factories. There's no safety measures, so there's lots of injuries, illnesses, and deaths. Pay is low because there's so many workers available. Now, while we play this game, students can't erase anything or replan where they put houses or factories. They simply just need to keep drawing them in. More factories on the rivers and other establishments. Now, once we reach the year 1785, a man named James Watt invents a new machine called the steam engine. The steam engine involves burning coal, which is a fossil fuel, to create steam, and somehow that makes energy. Anyways, let's just skip over the math and science part of how that all works. The bottom line is this: it is far more efficient and allows factories to be built away from the river. Now, more and more factories are drawn on their whiteboards. Eventually, I give them the okay to cut down the trees, and I feel like I all of a sudden had a classroom full of once-lers, and I was the Lorax trying to save the trees. They're so excited to cut down trees, erase it on their whiteboards so they can build more factories and apartment buildings. When we're done with the game, our maps went from peaceful rural villages to looking like this. Now, my hope in seeing all these scribbles gives you a picture of how fast change occurred and revolutionized villages into city centers or urban centers. The Industrial Revolution started in Great Britain due to a variety of factors: their proximity to waterways and access to rivers, geographic luck as they naturally had coal, iron, and timber, improved agricultural productivity allowed for people to be freed up from doing agriculture and could work, and it all goes from there. Suddenly, there's so many technological innovations. You don't need to know all of these, but I would know some of them so that you could use them in evidence in an essay, such as the flying shuttle or the spinning jenny. Both helped with the textile industry as people could weave faster and they could make more thread available. The cotton gin sped up how quickly cotton could be produced. The steam engine was absolutely huge as it allowed factories to be powered by coal and be anywhere, not just by rivers. Later, they put the steam engine on a vehicle on tracks, and we had our first locomotive and railroad. This all describes much of how the first Industrial Revolution happened. We know this as kind of the age of mechanical production, the age of the machine, moving from hand making things to the machine. The second Industrial Revolution is the age of science and mass production. It led to new methods in production of steel and chemicals and electricity and precision machinery during the second half of the 19th century, the late 1800s. Scientific principles were brought right into the factories. The assembly line was born, which effectively powered mass production. By the early part of the 20th century, Henry Ford's company was mass producing the groundbreaking Ford Model T, a car with a gasoline engine built on an assembly line in his factories. Thomas Edison will invent the light bulb, the telegraph, and then the telephone was created. Just imagine what your life would be like with just no electricity. We had some crazy storms last summer in which most of our city was out of power for a few days to a week. You start learning fast what life used to be like before electricity. Now, during this time, there were inventions that allowed people to travel more easily, move goods faster, increase trade, and live more comfortably. A new working middle class emerged and was often the people that owned the factories or had management positions. The middle class now had additional money where they could spend it on leisure activities like going to the theater or dining out in restaurants. But this by no means was the majority. The factory workers, this age offered a nonstop cycle of working and sleeping and going back to work in these dangerous conditions. It uprooted families and children who had to work for lower wages. Meanwhile, the factory owners were just getting richer and richer. The rapid urbanization that accompanied the Industrial Revolution increased pollution, poverty, it increased crime, public health crises. There was shortages of healthcare, insufficient infrastructure to accommodate urban growth. There were lots of negatives as well. As a response to this, one of the most famous and controversial works was published by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, the Communist Manifesto. While Adam Smith believed that free market capitalism would lead to better opportunities for everyone, Karl Marx pointed out that the factory workers were being exploited by the owners to make money in this capitalist system. One thing you need to remember about the historical context of the Communist Manifesto is this: Marx knows nothing about the history of the Soviet Union and of Chinese communism because none of that's occurred yet. That is what we think of when we hear the Communist Manifesto. Now, his point of view was rather just looking around and watching people firsthand be exploited through low wages and long hours in the factory setting. Now, while his beliefs will gain followings in Russia with intellectuals like Vladimir Lenin, there were others in the United States that also found hope in his message. However, in the United States, we will see that eventually more government regulations will be the answer for most people who are frustrated by the realities of the factory system. Eventually, minimum wage laws, safety protocols, labor unions will collectively bargain for these measures with a potential to strike if they did not follow through. And then this brought a more productive and a happy workforce without the need for Karl Marx's ideals. The Industrial Revolution spread initially from Great Britain to neighboring European nations like France and Belgium and Germany, as well as across the ocean to the United States. It will also spread to Russia and Japan. Let's spend just a little time comparing these areas, because some areas do this through private ownership and free market capitalism, and others are going to be more state-directed and led industrialization. In the United States, with their representative democracy, they had a more laissez-faire or hands-off view of industrialization. They did some tax breaks and they offered some public land for the building of railroads, for the transport of goods, but overall there were very few regulations on industries. The US was known for textile industries as well as oil, steel, car making. You probably are familiar with the names of Rockefeller with Standard Oil and Andrew Carnegie with the steel production and Henry Ford and the creation of the Model T. Now, the downfall in the United States was the gap between the rich and the poor. New slum neighborhoods developed and immigrants were taken advantage of as low-wage earners. Meanwhile, in Russia, they still had an absolute monarchy and the Tsar's power was pretty unchecked. Much like Peter the Great's push for westernization and modernization in the early 1700s, the Russian government itself pushed for industrial growth in the 1860s. They had state-directed industries versus those independently driven ones that we see in the United States and European nations. They focused on building the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which connected their vast empire. This also connected them to Asian markets. They focused on heavy industries like iron and shipbuilding and steel. And it's important to note that the freeing of the serfs in 1861 allowed them a new free labor source in the factories, and additionally a middle class also emerged in Russia. But many countries were negatively impacted by the Industrial Revolution centered around Europe, the United States, and somewhat Russia. There was a steep decline in Middle Eastern and Asian manufacturing. Shipbuilding in India and Southeast Asia declined significantly and just shifted towards Europe. The same is true of textile production in India and also in Egypt, which couldn't compete with the British and American textiles. Additionally, the long-term effects of international trade shifting to maritime routes since the 1500s will continue to impact the revenue of the Ottoman and Safavid empires. Plus, like intricate rugs that were made by hand in the Middle East were harder to sell when the British and the Americans could produce them much faster and much cheaper. Newly independent countries in Latin America had some rough periods of stability, with authoritarian-style governments once they were independent. And we're still focused on export industries, which led to some development, but no large-scale industrial revolution for them. Often this is called dependent development, as they were dependent on foreign nations to buy their raw resources. In other areas, European imperialism will dominate much of Africa and Asia during the late 1800s, where they're going to simply steal their natural resources, ignore their sovereignty, and force them into unequal treaties. Yay, Europeans! China will industrialize in some ways with the self-strengthening movement, and the Ottomans will attempt to with their Tanzimat reforms, but we're going to learn way more about that in the Unit 6 video. There's one Asian country that is the exception, and that is Japan. Remember, Japan was very isolated prior to this point. During this time of the Tokugawa shogunate, they cut off all international trade with Europeans except with the Dutch, and they were very opposed to outsider beliefs like Christianity. In 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry from the United States arrived to Japan with 4 giant Navy steamships outfitted with advanced weaponry. They were called the Black Ships due to their billowing black smoke that arose from the burning of coal for power. Thanks, Industrial Revolution, and were something that the Japanese had never seen before. The United States was looking for more places to sell their goods and wanted access to their markets. Check out this letter from Matthew Perry to the Tokugawa leadership. For years, several countries have applied for trade, but you have opposed them on account of a national law. If you are still to disagree, we would then take up arms and inquire the sin against the divine principles. And you also make sure of your law and fight in defense. When one considers such an occasion, however, one will realize the victory will naturally be ours, and you shall by no means overcome us. If, in such situation, you seek for reconciliation, you should put up the white flag that we recently presented to you, and we would accordingly stop firing and conclude peace with you, turning our battleships aside. Now, a source that clearly would be good to analyze point of view and challenge Perry's talk of sin and divine principles, or the idea that they sent them a white flag to surrender before this, it's like the ultimate flex of military might and gross confidence in their power. But what happens is the shogun creates this treaty and allows them access to trade. There was never fighting, and they never flew that white flag. Due to these events, there is a shift of power away from the shogun and the Tokugawa line, and they restored power to the emperor. This is known as the Meiji Restoration. It was during this time that Japan adopted state-supported industrialization. They built railroads and they had steamships, factories were created, private corporations arose, industrial families like the Mitsubishi Company became really wealthy, and Japan's growth was exponential. In fact, we will continue to talk about this later as Japan takes a page from the European playbook and becomes imperialistic themselves in Asia. And I'll leave you with this as a final claim about the changes and continuities during this period. 1750 to 1900 was indeed revolutionary as political structures and production changed significantly, while continuities of gender inequality, racism, and exploitation of lower classes continued. I hope this summed up a lot of Unit 5 more clearly in your head and prepares you for the upcoming test. Take the time to study the Quizlet deck in the description below, as you can feel more comfortable with some of the aspects that we left out of this video. Look at the terms, look at the key events, the places, and the economic changes. As always, thanks for tuning in. Hopefully you found this video very helpful in the test prep videos playlist. Subscribe, hit the bell to stay tuned for future videos, and we will see you for Unit 6 in the future. Thanks again for watching.